So one of the things that people say about the Hornet, because it doesn't have an AOA limiter, is that it can threaten with nose pointing. It's got great nose authority, so you can
Yeah,
effectively sort of sit it on its tail and still sort of move the nose around and point at people.
correct.
If you're in your little Alpha Jet and he's only doing 200 knots, isn't that what he's going to do? Then he's just going to use the angle of attack capability that he has to just keep the
Yeah.
nose pointed at you and just maybe get a tracking gunshot or a snapshot or something like that. Is that not how it works?
No, no, no. So, this starts out when you're sort of across the circle, and our noses are nowhere near each other. And then he does a big bite, but it's not enough. Okay, so he hasn't got his nose on you. He can't put a weapon on you. And then as you come around, you realize that he's not accelerating again. So then we just manage our airspeed, and eventually we'll land up on their tail. Yeah. But
Okay.
this idea that you can just point your nose everywhere, the F-22 can virtually do that. And now of course with the new missiles with the huge off foresight capability,
Mm.
they can basically just look at you and launch a missile if you're within range. It doesn't matter where your nose is. But back in this day, you had to be within parameters to shoot the missile. And it didn't have to be on the guy's tail. You even get your nose on him for a head-on A-9 shot. But the trick is not to get into as the uh, adversary to stay out of a position where he can get his nose on you within range to fire a shot.
Yeah. So it's not this sort of silver bullet, the nose pointing ability.
Yeah.
It's something that still has to be selectively used and carefully managed, and you're
Yes,
not just going to
absolutely.
go to that every time because it's
Correct.
okay.
Yeah. So here's another funny one. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression with respect to the Harrier about vipping.
Mm.
Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, it's vectoring
Yeah.
in forward flight.
Yeah. So there's this great myth that if you came into a fight and you got fairly slow and somebody was coming on the Harrier's tail, that he would just pull the nozzles and viff away from you and then drop back into your six, a bit like the first Top Gun.
Yeah.
Well, we used to fight the Harrier even in the Tornado, which is not a particularly maneuver airplane. And you go, oh, there he goes, he's vipping. Sorry, old chap, and you just go around the circle and then you gun him. And these are the Sea Harriers. They were the guys that that was their primary role, was air to air. It wasn't the bomber Harrier guys. So it's like, oh no, that's not gonna work, old chap. Sorry, sorry.
Such wonderful irreverence. Tell us about then. Tell us about DACT against other types. Then, I mean, I just had on the channel a good friend of mine who flew the Eagle, and he talked a lot about how he'd fight the Tomcat or how he'd fight the F-16, and he talked about the F-16, being able to develop 30 degrees of nose of angles on him at each merge, and he said, at the second merge, if he wasn't doing that well, he would bug out, he would leave the fight. How would you fight an F-16? How would you fight an F-15 in the Hornet? What sort of approach would you take to both of those types?
Yeah. So what the Eagle guy was getting at was the thrust to weight ratio. So the maneuverability of the two airplanes was quite close, as was the F-18. The F-18 was probably the lowest in terms of thrust to weight ratio and the highest in terms of maneuverability out of the three. But it gets back to the Alpha Jet fighting the F-18. So you had to really use that high angle attack capability very, very selectively. And the other thing we used to talk about is, you could be out doing this 1v1 dogfight, with the MiG-29 or whatever, and you're beating them and you're just about getting into position to shoot them. Well, what about all his buddies out there? When you're there in full afterburner at 70 knots, that's called being a flare. So anybody could launch a heat-seeking missile at you, and you got no maneuverability at that point. So we love to talk about this, high AOA maneuvering and all that kind of stuff, but it's really used as a last ditch maneuver where you have no choice. This is a knife fight in a phone booth, and it's either you or him. Yeah. But it's the last thing you want to do if you have any other options. Yeah. So getting back to your question, the F-14 is out of there. It's a bit like the Tornado. So it was designed as a fleet air defense interceptor, not a maneuvering fighter. Now, the later generations with the big GE engines, they were much, much better. But it's out of the picture. So the F-16, because it had this enormous thrust to weight ratio, it was the King Kong, really, of air combat. But the F-18 was close enough that we could force him into a high angle of attack regime, and they were limited to 25 degrees angle of attack. So it was hilarious. If you take it up into a vertical scissors, and they were accelerating like crazy because they had better thrust to weight. You go, okay, I'm just waiting, and then all of a sudden you'd see the nose falling off of the F-16, and you'd come up on the radio and they'd say, I see you're bowing to the superior aircraft, and you just pivot the nose on and get them. And they knew that, and they go, oh no, he's gonna do it again. But if you were in a classic two-circle fight, a high energy fight, they would just march around the circle on you and shoot you with a heater.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the F-15 too.
So
The F-15 didn't have the AOA limit, but they didn't like to fly it at high AOA, and it wasn't as maneuverable as the F-18. So we could beat them too in a slow fight. But really, the advantage of the F-18 was the high AOA capability.
Can you describe a little what it's like to fly the F-18 then in those regimes? You already talked about how you could go from 300 knots to 100 knots and not realize it. I'm asking layered questions, but it obviously has a full authority digital fly-by-wire control system. What does that mean to you as the pilot? What sort of cues is the aeroplane giving you that it's in different states of AOA? What was it like?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the full authority fly-by-wire system had built-in safeguards. So when you got to a certain AOA, and I can't remember what it was, you would lose the auto trim. So all of a sudden you're flying along slowly and you're going, why is the nose so high in the air? And then all of a sudden the stick comes forward and you're pulling back and you go, oh yeah, I'm only doing 120 knots. And it was the same thing when you're doing maneuvering. So, when you're pulling at high AOA, it requires a significant force on the stick to keep the stick back because you're losing the auto trim. It says, no, you don't want auto trim right now. That's your worst enemy. So now you're into fully manual with protections, but you're basically flying a manual type airplane. So you would feel it. The other thing was when you got above about 20 to 25 degrees AOA, the airplane would start shuddering. And what was happening is it's the airflow coming off the leading edge extensions of the airplane. And you can see that they extend right up to the front of the cockpit. But the air curls around that and it hits the vertical stabilizers in the back. And on one of I think it was probably the first trip we did on the conversion course on the F-18, we would get into a high angle of attack situation. And the instructor would say in the back seat, he would say, okay, I have control. Now you look back at the tails. And you could turn around, you could see the tails because of the bubble canopy. And they were doing this. It was scary to see them. Wow. Yeah. So after about, I think we had them for about 3 or 4 years, they discovered some significant cracking in the tails and also in the longerons and the fuselage. So they actually grounded the fleet for, I think, about a year and put all kinds of reinforcements in. And they also put the what are called the Lex fences on the front edge of the leading edge extension. So it's these two blades that sit up on the Lex, and that detours the air. Yeah, you can see it just above your left shoulder there. Yeah. That detours the airflow outboard of the vertical stabs. Yeah. And it was scary to see. Like I flew it before they had the Lex fences in, and the tails are they're no kidding. They're doing this. Wow. And you're going, ooh, that's probably not good.
Did you have then 7.33G and then a 9G override, something like that? Could you?
Yeah. So that's a great segue. So the airplane was limited to 7.5G. And I think the initial models didn't have, they either didn't have the G limiter or they didn't have the override to it. I guess they didn't have the G limiter. No, I think they had the G limiter right from the beginning. Maybe they didn't have the override. So we had the paddle switch on the front of the stick, and you could override the 7.5G limit because normally, unless you really snatched on it quickly, it wouldn't go above 7.5G. And it's another unfortunate story, and he was a friend of mine as well. He was on the course on the first F-18 operational squadron course. So this was the first course that they put through to generate an operational squadron. They were going to be an air defense squadron in Canada. So they're out doing the intercept practices with the F-18 against the T-33, which was acting as a target. And it was a cloudy day. I don't know what the ceiling was, maybe 2,000 feet. So the T-33 was operating beneath the cloud, and the F-18 profile was to come slicing down through the cloud onto the tail of the T-33. And these guys had, maybe 20 hours on the F-18, and they were sending them out solo to do this. So the warning flag should have been going off all over the place that this is probably not the best way to do this. So he sliced down through the cloud. The T-33 pilot was looking for him over his shoulder because he knew that he was coming down, and he watched him hit the ground. So they had a pretty good idea what happened. Well, I don't know if it was before or after, but within a space of probably 30 minutes, another solo pilot had done the same thing. And I think he pulled 11.5 G and missed the ground.
Wow.
So, yeah. So I don't know. I can't remember whether the paddle switch was there or it had different limitations before or after. But, the other pilot was the guy that was very fortunate that he didn't end up in the same position. Yeah. It's crazy things like, why were they doing that in the first place? And especially with a solo student, at least put an instructor in the back seat, because we had all kinds of 2-seat airplanes. It wasn't like we were short of airplanes, but, put an instructor in the back seat because we know this is potentially a very dangerous profile.